Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name is Madison, and in today's video I'm going to the beach, and at the beach I go to, at the public entrances, there's usually one of those little like free libraries where people can put the books that they brought to the beach in the library for someone else to read. So I'm going to be seeing if there's anything of interest in the little library. I did bring some backup books just in case, because it's hit or miss sometimes. So I'm going to see what this beach library has to offer me, and then I'm going to do some reading on the beach while I soak up some sun. I will see you at the beach library. All right, I found this, the little free library, and it is brimming with books. Lots of James Patterson, who's this? Blindsided. Lots of I don't want to say like $3 books you get at Dollar General, but you know the type of book. $3 this side though. It looks like there's a good one. There's an Anne Rule book in here. Let's see. We got Anne Rule, Worth More Dead. This is a promising one. I might take that one. Lots of books about dead people or murders, which is interesting. Oh, we got Nora Roberts. Let's see what's going on here. Nora Roberts, The Perfect Hope. Oh, this is a trilogy. Definitely don't want to start a trilogy on book 3. The Last Bookshop in London. Oh, that looks like an interesting one. The Last Bookshop in London. I will say though, there is quite the array of books in here. Like this one, The Incredible Incas, The Great War in Africa, Guerrillas, like guerrilla warfare. There's quite the variety. So it is fun seeing what other people read on the beach and then dropping off and then reading it again. So I think I'm gonna take The Last Bookshop in London, and then I'll let you know how it is. Alright, so I'm back at my chair, my little umbrella setup. I'm gonna start reading, and then I will update you as I get through the book, and I will let you know if it's a good one or not. But I will keep you updated. Oh my gosh, this is so cute. From one beach lover to another. Oh, that's so cute. I love it. Okay, so it's the next day. I didn't get through the whole book at the beach. I, as a very pale and fair person, was getting a little bit too much sun and needed to come home. I got through about 200 pages at the beach, and I finished it up here at home. So I would actually recommend this book, The Last Bookshop in London. It's a pretty quick and easy read. Nothing too crazy to wrap your head around. So I'm just going to go into like a basic summary of the book, and then I'm going to go into a more of a spoilery part of the book. I mean, if you're interested in reading this book, I'll tell you when the spoilers are going to happen. It's a really nice book about a girl who moves to London from her rural town just at the cusp of the beginning of World War I, and it goes through her experiences with getting a job and working with the ARP during World War II. It does focus, I don't want to say quite a bit, but a little bit about World War II. You don't really need to know a whole lot about World War II to understand what's going on. It's not very, if you don't know everything that happened in World War II, you're going to not understand anything that's going on in this book. If you do know things that happened in World War II, like if you're fairly knowledgeable about World War II, it'll just add like a little extra layer of what's going on in this book. But overall, it's a pretty great book. The pacing is, there were a couple bits where it was a little bit slow and maybe felt a little bit repetitive. For instance, when one of her friend that she moved to London, when she went away, when she would come back, she came back a couple times, like for Christmas, for holidays, for a weekend, and those events seemed a little repetitive. But overall, the pacing of the book is okay. I mean, every book has a little part of it around the middle when it gets a little slow, but it's kind of building up to the next part. or coming down from the original problem to working up to the second problem, that type of situation. But I'm gonna now go into a more detailed description of the book. I'm going to explain more about like the actual plot line and the characters. So if you have any interest in reading this book, I mean, you can stay on. It's not going to be super crazy spoilery, but I mean, if World War II historical fiction that revolves around ladies is your thing, you might want to stay tuned. So the main character of our book is Grace, and she and her friend Viv moved to London to move in with Grace's mom's best friend, Mrs. Rutherford. Grace's parents have both passed. Her dad in the Great War, as it is described in this book, because there had only been one world war at the time, and her mom has just previously passed away from disease. The house that her mom and her had lived in had been her uncle's house, so her uncle, upon her mother's death, decided to take over the house. So it was Grace, her uncle, her aunt, and their kids. So there was many people living in this house that had previously just been her and her mother. And she also was in charge of running her uncle's shop, and at the opportunity to move to London at the ask of Mrs. Rutherford, she offered them a room, Grace and Viv. Her uncle would not give her a recommendation letter to work at Harrods. It was a department store in London, and to work there you needed a recommendation letter, and her uncle, who owned the shop, would not recommend her or write her recommendation letter. So Grace, upon moving to London with Viv had written her own recommendation letter and quickly got a job at Harrods. Mrs. Rutherford's son, Colin, he worked at Harrods with the animals. From the description in this book, it kind of sounds like it was a department store and a little zoo, so that was interesting. She was able to get a job there in the department store with Colin's word and her recommendation letter that she wrote for herself. Grace, on the other hand, did not have a recommendation letter and was a little too good in her heart and did not want Viv to write one for her. So she took Miss Rutherford up on the opportunity to work at a local bookstore called Primrose Hill Books as an assistant to the shopkeeper, Mr. Evans. When Grace first goes to this bookshop, it is dusty, it needs cleaning, the organization system for the books is almost non-existent. It is kind of just books thrown on shelves with no rhyme or reason whatsoever. And Mr. Evans is elderly, he's got gray hair, and he is maybe just getting a little too in over his head with the bookstore by himself. And at first he's very apprehensive to hire Grace on as an assistant. After she spent the day dusting and cleaning, he kind of recognized that, oh, maybe it would be good to have an extra set of hands here. And Grace, who admittedly in the first part of the book is not very much into reading, meets a gentleman named George Anderson, and he recommends she read The Count of Monte Cristo. I myself have never read that book. There's a lot of classics that I have not read, which is something that I will be working on, getting myself caught up with the classic literature. But anyways, George is an avid reader, and Grace just feels like she does not have the time to read or the want or the drive. And so George recommends The Count of Monte Cristo, and at first she does that thing where she like kind of reads the first couple pages and doesn't really get into it. Probably wasn't in the right headspace, or she just wasn't there in the moment with the book. But eventually she revisited it and she devoured the book. She read it as much as she could under the covers with a flashlight, and it was kind of like her awakening into reading. And after she finished that book, she just started reading anything she could get her hands on, which is kind of, I like the way that this story presented getting into reading, because not everyone gets into reading the same way. I've been a reader forever, but I know people who just aren't really into reading, and sometimes it just takes that one book that really changes the way how you see reading to make you more of a reader. And I really like that way that it's presented. As Grace, she's not like a middle schooler or a high schooler. She's in her early 20s and she's never really been into reading, but she read one book and it made her fall in love with reading, which is enjoyable. I like how it presented that. But eventually she becomes really into reading and starts recommending books, and Grace is just a great upseller and starts selling books to housewives. Well, at this point the war has started. People are starting to want to get distracted from the war and make sure to have things for their underground bunkers for like the bombings that happened. That is a thing that happened in London during World War II. So they just want something to be distracted by, and a lot of the men had gone off. Colin, from the beginning, he went off to war, which totally destroyed Mrs. Rutherford. She was not the same after he went to war. And eventually Colin does die at the Battle of Dunkirk, and it is very devastating for Mrs. Rutherford and for Grace as well, because he lived in the house with her and he had been a childhood friend, so it was something that really impacted both of them. And Mrs. Rutherford goes on a nice little character arc with her experience with losing her husband in the First World War, and then now her son in the second war. She eventually ends up kind of adopting these two children whose parents died in a bombing, Jimmy and Sarah, and she ends up like earning Jimmy's trust with giving him some fresh made bread, and then she eventually gifts him some of Colin's old clothes, and it's a really, really nice roundabout way for her to get back to not her old self, but a better version of herself after her son had passed away, and she was able to take in these two children into her home and give them a better life than living on the streets after their parents had passed. So that was a nice little side story to Grace's main story. Grace is really into making this bookshop way better, or just trying to revamp the bookshop in a way that makes it more enjoyable, more pleasurable for people to come in who aren't regulars, who don't enjoy the chaoticness of a bookshop where things are just all over the place. So she actually does go to other bookstores that are successful and sees what they're doing. It is one of the ways that people are successful, is seeing what other people are doing around you that is successful and either mimicking or making it your own, but having a nice starting point to see like, where do I even begin? Because the way the bookshop is described, I can just see it as tall bookcases with books piled high, maybe 2 rows deep, or the categories are not there, but there's a nice little aside where it's like, well, this book is considered a classic, but it's also considered a love story, so there's like a little bit of a debate on whether or not it's to put it with the classics or the love story, but that's its own thing. It's a nice little cute little aside between George and Grace. So she gets some ideas from these other bookstores, setting up a table, like you go into like a Barnes & Noble, a Books A Million, and they have the tables down the middle with the new books to catch your attention, and making window displays to entice people to come in, changing them out throughout the seasons and to the people who are around, because at this time the men who were able to had gone off to war, so there was still a lot of housewives and older people who just couldn't go. So Grace and Mr. Evans really worked to make sure that they were targeting their desired customer base. So some pretty good marketing skills, I will say, that Grace has. She is quite the, I don't want to say entrepreneur, but she's quite the businesswoman. So she really takes on this bookstore and makes it her own. I forgot to mention that at the beginning of this, when Mr. Evans hired her on, it was to be for a 6-month period of time, and at the end of 6 months he would recommend her to work at Harrods because that was her main goal. But one of the things that Grace goes throughout this book is that she has fallen in love with the bookstore. She just doesn't want to leave, and Mr. Evans recognizes that, and he hires her on continuously after the 6 months, and even raises her pay a little bit to keep her there, because she and Mr. Evans have a nice relationship now, because at first Mr. Evans was a gruff kind of older man who just didn't really interact very well with others, but I guess he got more soft, more gentle as they interacted more. So at this time she starts working for the ARP, and she's stationed at a post with a gentleman named Mr. Stokes, and they go around after dark, because during this time in London they had to do blackouts at night so that the German bomber planes couldn't see targets very well. So they would go about and walk around the city, and if they saw anyone who was in defiance of this blackout, like if their curtains weren't drawn correctly, if light was coming out of the windows, they would go up to the door, knock on them, and then give them a verbal warning. Eventually they would get fined for having lights on. In the book it's described that even just like the tiniest sliver of light that is coming from a window could be seen by the German bombers, and it could be devastating for the people. So that's what she's also working on alongside with the bookstore. And also during this time her friend Viv goes and works for the ATS, and she's gone. She comes back for Christmas a couple times, but her and George, the gentleman from earlier, Grace and George had kind of a little bit of a flirtationship, if you will, at the beginning. They are writing letters back and forth. So Grace is really, I don't want to say alone or lonely. She has Mrs. Rutherford and she has Mr. Evans, but it is still her best friend and her flirtationship man are away, and they keep writing her. So that is also a thing that goes on throughout the story. Eventually, the German aircraft do start bombing London, and it is quite harrowing for Grace. She experiences a lot of different emotions with the bombings that happen. It is quite a lot to see. She saw probably more than she needed to see at her age, siege. Eventually, the Germans do actually start bombing London, and this book goes through the kind of Grace's feelings about how that is, because as an ARP warden, she would have to go and stop fires that happened and try to save people after the bombs had gone off. So it was kind of a lot for someone to be going through at that time. The author of this book does do a good job in describing how Grace is feeling throughout this time in her life, because it's really an impactful time for everybody. I mean, war is happening, everyone experiences different things. Eventually, the competitors' bookstores, they're all happen to be like in the same row of shops. They, unfortunately, that whole run just gets, the Thames, the river that they were going to use to put out the flames, the tide was very low, and they just could not use the water system that they had to put out the flames just because of where the tide was. And this whole run being bookstores, there was just so much tinder for the flames to just keep going. So a lot of her competitors' bookstores, they all lost almost everything. A lot of them did keep stock at their homes if it wasn't, like, if they didn't have like an apartment over the shop. So what Grace and Mr. Evans end up doing is they end up giving shelf space to these competing bookstores to sell their books that they have while they try to get back up on their feet. And eventually they do. In the book, it does say that they end up finding their own shops again, which is nice. But unfortunately, sometime later, a bomb does come down, not on top of the bookshop, but it does wipe out a lot of the front of the store. There's no door, the windows are blown out, there is a hole in the roof, and the books are all over the place. The shelves are broken just from the blast. And Grace, who also during this time, on top of running a bookstore, being an ARP warden, she starts reading aloud to people during when the air raids are happening and they all have to be in a shelter. She starts reading aloud to the people, and that really creates some great community throughout within her little pocket of London. All of the people who attend her readings, they just first immediately think of the bookshop when they hear where the bomb had gone off. So they work together and they get her bookshop back and running. And just before this happened, Mr. Evans, he was old and he unfortunately passed away, but he left the bookshop and the apartment upstairs to Grace. So this bookshop meant a lot to Grace. She had grown to love it. It was hers. It was her safe place. And the people who attended her readings, they just started immediately working together and they rebuilt the bookshelves. And the book is described as the bookshelves were in pieces. The shelves were in pieces. The sides of the shelves were in pieces. It was all just a bunch of pieces. But they end up making these makeshift bookshelves with the pieces all mixed, matched in together. So they build those back up and they repaint and rename the bookshop the Last Bookshop in London, hence the name of the book. And it does continue to be a place where people go, where they can feel welcome and kind of forget the craziness and the sadness and the anger of war. The book ends with Grace with her, and that's kind of where the book ends. There's a small little epilogue, but for the main story, that's where it ends. It is a very bittersweet ending to a book, which is to be expected, I guess, with a book that is occurring during World War II. So there is the happiness that her bookshop has not been destroyed by bombs, but there is still the surrounding uneasiness and unsureness of war. It just ends up being a very tiny little bright spot in the darkness of war. And I think that really encompasses a lot of how the civilian life was for World War II, and it is a nice little snapshot, even if this isn't based on real people, but of a very, I would say, plausible situation that could have happened during World War II. And there is a tiny little epilogue that happens just after the war has ended. Her friend Viv comes back and they talk about all the things that they did during the war, and then her and George end up meeting again. He does come back for Christmas during the book, and they go on a nice little date to the Ritz because he was only here for 3 days, but they do end up getting back together, and she waited for him throughout the war, and it doesn't really go into very much of what their relationship ends up being, but the way it left off, it seems like they are going to be a very happy couple for the rest of their lives. So in the end, I recommend this book. If you like historical fiction, it's a great book. It's pretty easy to read, nothing too crazy. It is, I guess I would say, a good beach read as someone, I myself and someone else had read this at the beach. It's a good book if you like World War II. It's a good book if you like reading books about people who like reading books. So that is also a theme that we got going on. But overall, a good beach read, a good find from the take a book, leave a book at the library. Next time I go to the beach, I will leave a book. So sometimes the free books at the beach are a hit or a miss. This one was a hit. And with that, I will see you in the next one. Bye!